Just a word about the panel before we get started. In recent years, the reason I've convened this is because in recent years, Indigenous artists and curators in North America have spearheaded really exciting initiatives, including publications, projects, running labs, um, stepping into newly christened curatorial positions, and starting to steward collections, and using Indigenous research frameworks and Indigenous knowledge to guide those efforts. And this has been a really exciting moment that's added, both to the canon of art history, but also to fields of artistic practice, and really opens up possibilities for all of us to think about how we create knowledge, how we bring knowledge to bear, and how we produce it in community and with peers in institutions and in the work that we do in art history and in the curatorial field. So I wanted to convene, luminaries who are here among us and have certainly been in conversation before. And I'm really happy to convene you all again to explore this topic, maybe from a more precise angle or a slightly different one. So we have a lot of people on the screen, and we'll move through our short hour, starting with Jeffrey and Candace. We'll move on to hear from Dare Turner, and we'll finish with Kite. And there may be some conversation, of course, in between. And then 10 minutes before 8, we'll pause and turn it over to questions from the audience. And at any time during this panel, you can feel free to type your question in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I'll be reviewing those, and then when we open it up for questions, I'll be selecting questions that have been submitted through that function. So you can send them at any time. Briefly, to introduce our panelists before we get started, Jeffrey Gibson is a member of the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians and Cherokee descent. He is an interdisciplinary artist, and of course, Jeffrey has exhibited widely and is very distinguished and has many awards, which I won't list here, but I will highlight that in 2024, Jeffrey represented the United States in the American Pavilion at Venice in the 60th Venice Biennale Arte, and it was this first solo presentation of an Indigenous artist for the US. 1 year before that, Jeffrey co-edited a book titled An Indigenous Present, which resulted in a major traveling exhibition, which I just saw at the ICA Boston, actually, Jeffrey, on Friday. And that was a real treat. And it will continue on to the Frisk Museum in Nashville and the Frye Art Museum in Seattle later this year. So you all have many chances to visit, hopefully. Candace Hopkins is a citizen of Karkosh-Tagish First Nations. And we just clarified she lives upstate, not in Red Hook, New York. She's executive director of Forge Projects in Taughannock and was senior curator for the 2019 and 2022 editions of the Toronto Biennial of Art, as well as part of the curatorial team for the Canadian Pavilion at the 58th Venice Biennale Arte. A lot of Venice biennial action here. She's curated many notable exhibitions, and for our purposes tonight, in 2023, she curated the exhibition titled Indian Theater, Native Performance, Art, and Self-Determination since 1969 at the Hessel Museum of Art at Bard College. And in 2025, she edited Native Visual Sovereignty, A Reader in Art and Performance, which was a companion volume to that exhibition. And we'll hear more about both of those. Moving on to Kite. Kite is an enrolled citizen of the Oglala Sioux tribe and lives also in Catskill, New York. An artist, composer, and scholar, she is director of the Wanahable Saw Center for Indigenous AI. Kite, do you want to correct how I pronounce that?
We humble.
Thank you. It's a National Endowment for the Humanities designated Humanities Research Center at Bard College, where she is. Are you Distinguished Artist and Resident Assistant Professor of American Indigenous Studies? You're also the director of this lab, no? Right. She's also co-PI and co-director of the International Abundant Intelligences Research Program, which I hope you'll talk to us more about. And she's recently presented major projects with Creative Time, the Institute of American Indian Arts Museum of Contemporary Native Arts, MIT List Visual Arts Center, and her work has been featured internationally in the Guatemala, Whitney, Sao Paulo, and Shanghai biennials. Dare Turner Here in Brooklyn with us, she is a member of the Yurok tribe of California and is the curator of Indigenous art at the Brooklyn Museum. In 2024, she co-organized the museum-wide initiative titled Preoccupied, Indigenizing the Museum at the Baltimore Museum of Art, which included, this is astounding, 9 exhibitions, interpretive interventions across the museum, a publication guided by Native methodologies, and an array of public programs. At Brooklyn Museum, where she is currently, she has curated Anain, I See Your Light, which utilized beadwork designs by Nico Williams to transform the museum's outdoor plaza, and co-curated Towards Joy, New Frameworks for American Art, a radical reimagining of the American wing guided by Indigenous ways of knowing and Black feminist theory. So thank you all for being here. And I'd like to open then by turning to Candace and Jeffrey. So 2023 was a big year. Jeffrey, you published your book, An Indigenous Present, which showcases a diverse array of approaches to Indigenous concepts, forms, and media. And Candace, you opened your exhibition, which we just mentioned, at Bard. And then I'm so interested in the fact that then both of you, one started with an exhibition, one with a publication, and then you sort of switched places. And now Jeffrey has a show, an exhibition that's at ICA Boston that he curated, to be precise, of others' work. And Candace, you have come out last year with the reader that accompanies your show. So if I could get both of you to just reflect a little bit on this process, perhaps why an exhibition or a publication first? How did that guide your thinking? And then at what point did it become necessary to move into a publication or an exhibition? And if you could reflect also just on publishing as a form of knowledge making and why that seemed like an important gesture to do in this moment and with the work that you were dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Want to start, Candace?
You want me to start, Jeffrey?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Well, I know we've talked about this a lot, Jeffrey, also when you were thinking about an Indigenous presence. So, you and I can go back and forth a bit. So mine, exactly that. Catherine started a little different had a different origin point than Jeffrey's. So Native Visual Sovereignty, this is the book, is a reader. And the reason that it's a reader is because, well, there are many reasons that it's a reader. One, I was surprised that there hasn't yet been a reader published on Native art at all, and I wanted to fix that. Number two, I thought that the format of a reader actually offered a lot more possibilities of opening up knowledge, sometimes than exhibition catalogs can do. So I was thinking of this text as the text that I would have wanted when I was a student. So something that's comprehensive, that can go deeper on a subject, that includes reprints of materials, that includes archival materials all the way back to 1969, that includes artist responses, that includes scripts and poetry. And so I was thinking about a book that could match the energy and ideas that sparked the Indian theater movement. And that was really the basis for the exhibition Indian Theater, where it gets its title from. And it's actually this document here, and it's of course not going to be easy to see on the screen, but it's a document from 1969 called Indian Theater, an Artistic Experiment in Progress. And it was published by the Institute of American Indian Arts in July of 69. It was done collaboratively between the then president, Lloyd Kievanu, the director of drama and dance, Roland Meinholtz, and students at the time who were part of the Institute of American Indian Arts. The way that it begins, in fact, is this credo for American Indian theater that Lloyd Kievanu authored. And just to give you a bit of background, Lloyd Kievanu was a artist. He was the first native to, and firsting isn't always a good thing. It actually just shows sometimes like a lack of support. He was the first native artist to attend the Chicago Art Institute, and it was kind of hard won. He first had to convince the Bureau of Indian Affairs to give him a loan so he could go. And he was denied, I think, 2 or 3 times, he shared in his autobiography, because they said, we tried that once and it didn't go well. In terms of, we tried to fund one Native artist, one Cherokee person to pursue higher education. But he persisted and he went, and he said that he almost dropped out in second year because of the extreme kind of culture shock that he had, moving from his home community in Oklahoma to Chicago. But part of the reason that I'm sharing all that is because he then became a real advocate for Native education, and he in fact called himself an infiltrator. And he started what would be the kind of, speaking of labs, and I know, Kite, you're going to talk about that in a bit, but the kind of first lab for Native contemporary art. And it was the Southwest Indian Arts Project that was funded by the Rockefellers, in fact, by a grant from their foundation. And he brought together the kind of first faculty then in the 1950s in Scottsdale that would be core faculty for the Institute of American Indian Arts when it was founded in 1963. So that included people like Fritz Scholder. It included Charles and Ottilie Lolema. Charles taught jewelry, Ottilie taught ceramics. And because of the kind of proof that was offered from that first Native art school, a vocational school, they called it, they were able to make the case that IA could actually get off the ground. So I was really invested in Native self-determination from the beginning, but also in extreme innovation and experimentation. So Lloyd Kivenew believed that the kind of heart of Native art was fully contemporary, very cosmopolitan, that students who were coming didn't necessarily have to be kind of tethered to market desires in terms of what kind of work they were going to produce. And they came up with this profound idea that they also wanted to create what they termed new Native theater. So they created this treatise. And I was so inspired by this treatise when I came across it when I was working as a curator at the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts, just part of IAIA. And it made me realize that this spark was a way to tell a different art history and the beginning of a very different art history, and an origin point for the history of Native performance in these lands. So the script itself became the kind of ethos and the tone, and even the way that they used notes as a literary device in the script became the form of the curatorial notes that I wrote throughout the exhibition. So they were already kind of literary. And then that format of the note became the kind of principle for a lot of the artist-driven texts that then we commissioned for the book as well. So it included, I think, actually 44 contributors in this volume. And I would say what I was trying to do as well is to think about the publication as separate from the exhibition itself. Like, I think, Jeffrey, you'll probably speak to this too, how publications have a different kind of life and legacy than exhibitions. And I thought it was this profound opportunity to kind of go deeper into a very particular kind of performance art history, because of my feeling that a lot of survey exhibitions, particularly of contemporary Native art, often are only a survey of the last 10 years. So it's almost like we get caught in a cycle of perpetually reintroducing ourselves, when in fact we have this profound depth of practices. And I was thinking about then how performance and agency form the basis for how we understand Native visual sovereignty, which is its own thread throughout the book, starting from Jolene Rickard's essays that form another kind of narrative thread throughout the book, but they themselves were informed by the work that Native photographers were doing in the 1980s, when they kind of came to the self-realization collectively that what they were doing was visualizing sovereignty. So that was a kind of long intro, but But Jeffrey, I know that I'm really interested in the intersections between these kind of these books as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was great. And Candace is also in An Indigenous Present, and I'm one of the note contributors to her book as well. And I think books in particular, I've grown up working in museums with North American collections, and in particular working on NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, in the early 90s, just when the law passed. And I think so my connection to artists and publications come out of that time when I was experiencing a lot of disappointment in how little my professors knew about contemporary and modern Native art. So at the time, Jean Quick to See Smith was known, James Luna, Edgar Heap of Birds, and Kay Walking Stick. And this was sort of who I kept getting referred to as these four artists. And as much as I love them, I was really wanting to just have a bigger context to move within. And so a lot of the artists who I met, especially Jean, really stressed the publication, because the publication is so much how the exhibition and the knowledge would continue. And without the publication, it was, if you were there, you were there. And if you were able to engage on a kind of thoughtful level, it was a small distribution in a way, a small distribution of knowledge. And some of those catalogs I have actually tracked down. Jean was somebody who really produced these small run publications, and so grateful that she did. So that it was sort of, in a way, it was kind of indoctrinated into me about this book and Native art history in particular. And then when I got a grant from the Creative Capital Foundation in 2005, it involved me researching a piece of land in my family just outside of Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And so I went to Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and I went to the microfiche archives of the Cherokee Heritage Center. And I was amazed at how much information was in this microfiche film. I mean, there's literally thousands of tiny pieces of microfiche, and you have to research it and go in and look at it. But it was there that I actually discovered the Cherokee Phoenix, which was a publication which they have the full archive going back into the late 19th century. And what's so interesting when I discovered that was there were many Native people who were protesting the acceptance of the land through the Dawes Act. And that voice is never part of the history that we're taught, that there was an active negotiation going on for 30 years. And so that became so interesting to me, because it meant, as a Native person standing with my community, you could disagree, you could have disagreements. There were negotiations that were really thoughtfully driven. And so it kind of, in many ways, it kind of gave a sense of autonomy to my ancestors that I think had otherwise been taught to me through history as victims and as impoverished, or as unable or without autonomy. And so I thought that was such a huge kind of eye opener for me to kind of rethink my own relationship to being Native. So I think, for me, because of the way I grew up, like moving around, and a lot of times my exposure to Native communities was really just through my family, through my very immediate family, so grandparents, aunts, uncles, but usually through visiting. Oftentimes growing up abroad, I lived in Korea, I lived in Germany. I was looking at the US through a kind of curated pop cultural lens of American culture. And so oftentimes that didn't include Native people. But what it did include was this kind of enticing kind of projection of what art creativity looked like, in particular in New York City. So that was enough for me to feel like that's where I needed to be. Like, I needed to be in New York City. I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be a part of that scene. So that also influenced the kind of publications that I was looking at. And so editorial publications had such a big influence on me. And I think growing up in the 80s and the 90s, the kind of merging of pop cultural media, television, image creation, of course, heading into like digital image creation. And they all those walls started coming down, right? And so I think what I felt like was lacking is a beautiful coffee table publication of Native artists. Oftentimes, my experience was that I had oftentimes learned about Native artists in academic journals, where the academic writing, if we just look at the real estate of the page, the academic writing is maybe 60 to 75% of the page. And then the image oftentimes is, it's a different budget for publication. It's a different interest and a different audience. And I grew up thinking about like, I want edge to edge, like perfect color, glossy images. It's just, and I understand the potential criticism of like, well, this is surface and superficial, but I was like, Native people, I want us to see ourselves in that way. And so I remember when we proposed the book, and Janelle Porter was my editor and co-publisher, co-editor. And I remember when we approached different publishing houses, the comps that they would share with us were oftentimes museum collection catalogs. And so I was like, no, this is not what this is. Like, so there was no comp for like the price point that we wanted. I mean, it's nearly a 7-pound book. And I kept saying, I was like, let's make it 8, let's make it 9. I don't care. Like, I think I love the impracticality of what art can be, that we can lean into that kind of impracticality. So I think what was the surprise was I think the book may have gone into its fifth edition. And so and it wasn't a huge run. I think our first edition was, I want to say it was maybe 1,500, but we've gone into our 5th edition. And so it was clear that there was a need, there was an audience for this kind of book. And just talking to other Native artists, I think just how small our community of artists really continues to be right now, that we all know each other. Like, and so people were like looking in the book and saying like their kids were looking in the book and being like, I know this artist and I know that artist and we know their kids. And so it's been this really kind of amazing. I always tell people it's like there's so many things that you can't control, so when you put a book like that out into the world, you really can't control what's going to happen with it or who's going to respond to it. And I mean, I love walking into like, gallery directors' offices and seeing the book, walking into museums and seeing directors with the book on their desk. But I think I really just wanted to, again, I attended so many academic conferences about Native American art going back, let's say, until the early 2000s, until about mid 2010s. And they were fantastic, but really the thinking in those tends to be based within museologic and anthropologic thinking about how to describe and discuss Native American art. And so for me as an artist, it wasn't kind of compelling me to like think radically outside of that space. And I think that that's what the editorial version of how to show this work was able to do. It was just sort of like, if you're making work today, if you're pursuing your work you're kind of inserting it and forcing it into the greater art world, the larger art world. Here's a glossy platform where we want to shine a light on you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Jeffrey and Candace. That was such a great narration, and also just to hear both of you, Candace, I'm thinking of this, this, what do you call it, a manifesto? It was
A treatise.
a
Yeah.
treatise. So the treatise, which you had reproduced in your exhibition, and I believe it was, it's a very humble looking, sort of Xerox with a orange cover and, standard size, typewritten, flip through it, pages. So to go from this publication to Jeffrey's, glossy coffee table book, is a really beautiful and exciting arc to think about. But it is also that small publication. Again, just speaking to what a publication can do, that you found that, Candace, because it was a publication in some form, written text that outlasted these ephemeral performances, which
Mm-hmm.
is the nature of performance, of course, captured on video. And your exhibition had some really rare and fantastic videos of early performance works. but essentially, like, right, that's the promise of the publication. Like you said, Jeffrey, someone comes along, someone comes across it, it turns up somewhere. And what happens with that is unpredictable. So the way these two publications speak to each other is across time is exciting.
Yeah.
Um,
Jeffrey wrote a script for the Native Visual Sovereignty book. And it was a performance, so there was like that dialogue as well, which I think is kind of fantastic. I think that in a way, both of the books chart different dialogues, Jeffrey, like in terms of relationships between artists. I think mine does so through the work and the kind of literary element, but I think yours it really tries to chart a movement now.
Hmm.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. Yeah, and that's something that I was also gonna, I mean, we'd probably move on to Dare and you all can continue to discuss, but Jeffrey's book to me feels like this big tent that wants to, give us a sense of the now of Indigenous and Native arts practice and platform, really the visuals. But you also have so much substantive oral history, and this is not to say that they're just pictures in the book. But, and then Candace um, has this red thread that you draw through the work. And this performance gives us this more like a focused way to go through it. And Jeffrey gives us this just sort of extremely rich, branching paths. And you can choose whichever one you want to pursue through the book, which you probably go back to many times.
Just really quickly, I just want to say one thing. I remember when Janelle and I were editing the book, sometimes I feel like, with kind of like aesthetics of a decade or aesthetics of a moment, it's you almost are fearful to mark it so clearly in that moment. But with this, I felt it was important that like this was what's happening right now in this like 5 to 10 year period. And really what that was hoping to do was to create a kind of milestone for the next iteration, whether it's made by me or by somebody else. There will be another time, there will be more artists. And this was just to like kick the ball off.
It's such a great point that whenever you're doing a project like this that's going to live on and is sort of like a first offering in an ever-growing field that's going to get denser and denser in terms of its bibliography and its references, that you're going to in some way be like people are going to be
Yeah.
pressing it off against it at some point. It'll have its reception, and then people will start to say, well,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
Jeffrey Gibson claimed, and then it builds, and that's discourse, right? That's the point. So I love that you were thinking about that at the time, and yeah, I think everyone wants a kind of like vintage looking. I mean, this is part of the pleasure of the treatise is that it looks so of '69. It looks so much like something you typed. It was something you typed on a typewriter and produced quickly. Dare, I feel like Jeffrey had wonderful segue in talking about museological practice and these conferences that he was attending and the frustrations that you were having, Jeffrey, in those rooms and trying to visualize yourself as a contemporary artist in those spaces. And Dare, I think that speaks to some of the work that you've been doing in reorienting museological thinking on the subject of Native art and Indigenous makers. So, would you like to take it on from
Sure.
here?
I think that maybe I'll start with a little bit of my background. So I've been at the Brooklyn Museum now for a few years, since 2023. And at Brooklyn, I care for over 13,000 objects from all Indigenous people of all time who are lived in what is now Canada, the United States, and Greenland. So it's a lot of terrain, and I am expected to be an expert in all of this vast terrain. So, something that was mentioned earlier is the fact that Native people are not a monolith. I can't speak on behalf of this woman who created this basket in the 19th century. I feel even hesitant to speak on behalf of my whole tribe. That's something that I want to be very careful in positioning myself within this museum context. So I view myself really as a steward of relatives. When I go into storage, into the vault, and visit these belongings, I really feel like I'm visiting relatives. And by recognizing them as such, this infuses them with the agency that they already have. So this is something I think about, as I'm producing shows, thinking about what the next curatorial project might be. This is something I think about when I'm writing, and this is something I really reckon with when I'm working with the archives. So many thousands of objects were collected in the early 1900s by the museum's first curator of ethnology, Stuart Cullen. And I'll just give Jeffrey a plug. You did some deep work with the Cullen Archive in your very important exhibition at Brooklyn was that 2020, 2021? Um, so we have a shared sort of understanding of the complexities of this archive, but essentially Stuart Cullen would go on major collecting expeditions, buy 100 things, buy 1,000 things, and his sources or the ways in which he documented these objects might have been by the pound. So I purchased 20,000 pounds of Native American belongings and brought them back to New York. And sometimes they were really detailed in what I view as his diary. So when he would go on these collecting expeditions, he would keep a very detailed log of, I bought this from this person in this town, and we ate this food at their house, and she was rude to me. And it just goes into really personal narratives that can be kind of arresting in a way. As you're encountering these agents, again, I feel the presence of the makers as I'm reading Stuart Cullen's very sort of biased interpretation of their interactions. But what is it to try to give that agency back to the makers? We know some of the women who wove baskets in our collection, and a lot of museums out there don't even know the specific tribe. They may have a region, but I feel blessed in one sense by these documents, but in the other sense, it's traumatic and really weighs you down to open these catalog cards, shuffle through and see, oh, the body of a mummified child, which was later repatriated, thankfully. But this is something where you have to really kind of weigh your role as a curator and think about this trajectory of the curator of Stuart Cullen to the curator today. I often think, like, what would he think of an Indigenous woman like running this collection? I wonder if this is something that would have been in alignment with his goals or a huge departure. I can't speak on his behalf, but I sit with it a lot. And I think about it a lot as I'm building different curatorial projects. I've worked with historic collections for years now, and this is an incredible privilege. And I love to bring them into dialogue with contemporary artists when that's desired. That's not something I'll ever foist on anybody. But we actually can see in the background here, this was Nico Williams's installation at Brooklyn that comes out of this archival engagement. So I invited Nico to come do a site visit. We knew we wanted to program the stoop with him. He's such a talented bead worker, and he really wanted to understand our collection, get to know the Anishinaabe belongings that we care for. And so a part of the visit was going to visit storage. And this is something where I'm very careful in like prepping people. Nico didn't need any of this sort of prep, but sometimes this is people's first visit to the museum and they'll see all of these belongings and really feel feelings. Sometimes it's sadness, sometimes it's joy, and we need to be able to have space and hold space for those feelings. Sometimes I cry in there, and that's okay, and that's just what happens. And we can come at that with compassion. So part of our day, after we got to talk, walked around the site outside. We visited some Anishinaabe belongings that I had pulled out that I thought might be of interest. We could also walk the aisles too. And he was immediately drawn to the same object that I was so drawn to, this beautiful legging that incorporated ribbon work and bead work and unusual patterns. And that was what he used to seed this project here. So I think that it can be a very generative space to have these dialogues, like intergenerational dialogues between historical belongings and artworks made today. And I also like to think about the way that these things live on. So books are the life, the extended life of any of the curatorial work we do. I know Stuart Kulin's handwriting. I'm with his books a lot. And that is the way that his presence lives on with me. And it lived on in shows like Jeffries, is calling attention to that important resource. I make it available to tribal community members when they want to know what was collected, why, when, what, all of the circumstances. It's really important for that information to be shared and discoverable because that's how Kulin's legacy lives on. And I like to think about, I have a super different legacy, but I also hope to really capture it with publications. Working on the Baltimore Museum of Art program, Preoccupied Indigenizing the Museum that you mentioned before, happening the same year that this show behind me was happening, and the American Wing reinstallation. A big part of that project as well was documenting what we did with our publication and pushing against the museum bubble that Jeffrey, you were speaking about with the conferences. When I go to conferences, the part that is the best, the part that I like is getting coffee, visiting with people, popping the panel bubble. There is so much to learn, and I'm super grateful for those panels, but I feel like I learn twice as much when we get coffee and chat after, because then I get to know a person. I don't get to just know the role and hear the sort of like professional panel presentation. I get to see what you like to eat and hear about your kids, and that fleshes out a person. It creates a person instead of a role. So with Preoccupied, that was really important to that was a shared goal of our project. I co-curated it with Leela Grothy, and we had a wonderful curatorial fellow, Elise Boulanger, and we wanted to come to the artists we were collaborating with on these different solo shows where maybe they were working with the historical collection as well, and invite them in. I served dinner at my house with my screaming children in the background, and we just came together as like families. And the one little nugget I'll plug before passing it off to Kite is we did something for that project called the Unconference, where we invited all the artists who were featured in the show, all the catalog writers, these major stakeholders, to come and stay with us in Baltimore at the Last Resort Artist Retreat Center run by Derek Adams. And that was a space where we had a couple of dinners. We had conversations we wanted to have. We got to do site visits and visit the collection. But as the ground floor, we really got to know each other as people, by cooking tacos together and hearing about what foods people like and what they had, how they cook with their kids. You get to understand a person's perspective in a better way. And I think that brings more empathy and care to curatorial practice.
Thanks, Dare. Kite. So I wanted to ask you, as so many do on this panel, wear many hats. You're an artist. You are also directing these labs. If you could tell us, and you're also a professor at Bard, if you could tell us a little bit about how these labs, how these were developed, and what's the relationship between these two labs and these initiatives, one of which is international. And what do you do? What do you do at a lab for Indigenous AI?
Yeah. So I'm an artist and I'm trained as a composer and my real language is experimental art, and what I want to spend my time doing is experimenting and also doing what a lot of us here are interested in doing, which is moving money into the hands of young Native artists. And I I was invited actually by Candace in I think it was 2015, 2016 to the Banff Center where was where I did a residency, and I met Jolene Ricard, and I was and Nadia Mir, and I learned what like the indigenous new media art world was. And from there I studied with Jason Edward Lewis and his wife Skawanati, and I learned how to run a new media an indigenous new media lab through university, which is just one way to be an artist in practice with a constant support. Um, Learning how to work with grants and I learned a lot from the way Canadian art approaches art making in new indigenous new media, which has a really wonderful legacy since the 90s and even before then. And that history helped me understand that I could um, also work in a similar way. So the Wehamli Sa'a Center is in its first and current iteration at Bard College, and um, it's a lot of things at this point. I'll just describe it. It's really it's a place. It's a big open studio space in a very old building that's always being repaired. Um, it's got a ton of art supplies. It's got students coming in and out constantly. I think I have about 20 research assistants, some of which are throughout the week, some of which come on for certain. We just finished a huge beading project for the Wagner Foundation and Black and Indigenous Dreaming Project. We are we're all working on this like kind of goopy star comet thing for PS1's Greater New York. So we're making art, and then simultaneously we have another room which right now is kind of empty, and it's being set up to do EEG research with my amazing postdoctoral fellow Antoine Belmar. Supported by other technical research fellows who are master's students in Center for Human Rights and the Arts. And the EEG research is very wonderfully funded by our Abundant Intelligences research program, which grew out of a paper and long arguments and discussions over the years with Jason Edward Lewis, who's my mentor and PhD advisor. And we published a paper with Archer Pachowis and Noelani Arista called Making Kin with Machines. And then we went on to publish a white paper called Indigenous Protocols for Artificial Intelligence in 2020. And Abundant Intelligences is about, I think it's 49 co-investigators. Half of our, most of our team is in Canada, and then a large number of us are in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I think I'm the only, we call ourselves pods, so I'm the only research pod in the United States. And each pod is grounded in community. We have knowledge holders, we have Indigenous steering committees. Um, we have a lot of mentorship and leadership, mentorship to myself from amazing supporters like Sarah Diamond. And then we in turn mentor the next generation of students. Um, and I feel like what we're, I really have I refuse to separate my practices. I think that doing truly experimental artistic research means not saying that my research into semantic, like really investigating what other like alternatives to AI are there and how do we get away from chatbots and go back into meaning. And that's why I'm interested in dream language and beadwork and the movement of knowledge from one world into the other through performance and through wearing your dreams. I think that is should be funded by science funding. I also think it should be supported by arts funding. I think students should be involved. I think elders should be involved. I think along that process, I need like next week, everybody is welcome to our open house on Monday evening, where we will be doing Lakota hand games, which is an amazing algorithmic practice of gambling, along with uh, uh, tapping maple and smoking deer hides that we've worked ourselves. I think they're all effort towards the same really important indigenous ways of making new knowledge and ethical ways in the world. And so it's called, right now we call this kind of computational craze AI. I'm sure it'll be called something different later. But indigenous people, I think I remember the first crazy artwork to blow my mind when I learned about it at the Banff Center was Lawrence Paul Lupton's made VR in the early 90s at the Banff Center. And that VR was to now we would be I people would be horrified. It's so radical. He wanted to have a ceremony in VR. And Archie Pachawis called for the same thing. I don't think I'm calling for that. That is like really intense to me. But I think Native people are extremely technologically experimental, and we are excellent at doing radical new things in a good way. So, thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. Kite, sorry. This is Her name is Suzanne. Her name is also Kite. We are calling her Kite. This is how she goes as an artist. Kate, just really quickly, because that was really great, and I know you don't want to talk at any length about the AI stuff, but just to if you could maybe just give us like a little soundbite about what was the original attraction or impetus in like thinking about AI and indigenous like knowledge frameworks, and I think it had something to do with relation, and what an indigenous framework could bring to our understanding of other life forms. If I'm
Yeah, if I think that's basically it. I was making my own computer like MIDI controllers for the body so I could move on stage and control sound and video. That's what I'd studied in college. And then I was introduced to early machine learning for performance by Letitia Sonami, and I thought, this is interesting. I'm gonna make a sci-fi about this. So I made Listener, which was included in soundings and in Indian theater. And that performance was like the first machine learning performance that I did. And in the midst discussing that, and actually with Jackson Two Bears, was who I very, very first discussed this with in 2018. I wrote my contribution to Making Kin with the Machines, which argues that Native people, especially Lakota people, already have really good relationships with stones. And we know how to make relationships with stone beings. And what are computers if not melted stones? So that is the ontological framework that I argued.
Yeah. And I know you're very far away from that original piece of writing now, but rereading it, it just struck me again at like how brilliant that is. Thinking about resource extraction and as, something we always need to keep in mind with this like supposedly immaterial new technology that we're all floating around in. And so to bring to bear a knowledge system about how to relate to non-humans when we're thinking about moving and relating to, new forms of possibly being technology, who knows? Really generative, and what I really appreciated too about your refusal to silo, that I think dare is something you probably encounter in a survey museum. I think, enlightened survey museums are constantly now trying to break down the walls of their silos, but, traditionally, Western forms of knowledge are incredibly siloed, and PhD programs are designed to give you very specific and deep cores of knowledge that shall never blend or reach beyond their own little wells. And that a really radical proposition of Indigenous research frameworks, and what I've heard, in Jeffrey's talk and in yours, and I think also Dare, is saying, it's a refusal to accept silos in this way. I mean, a sort of more relational and universal understanding of how we can move through various knowledges, how it could all be one knowledge. I'm sure someone can put that more eloquently if someone wants to pipe up.
Right. I'll just say that, when we were doing the book, An Indigenous Present, trying to figure out how to order the artists or how to place them, who went next to who. There's so many options, within the history of editing, book editing, but also curatorial practice. And I think I kept kind of saying, you just kind of had to let the work speak to you. So we didn't actually do like, three or four images of an artist's work and then the next artist. We actually broke them up. And sometimes there would be an artist who had like two works side by side, and then maybe another artist and then another artist, and they might find themselves another 30 pages into the book. A lot of it, I think, has to do with trust. And I feel like that's been one of the best things about my generation of Native people. I mean, I'm getting ready to turn 54, but I think there's a greater trust happening, I think, between Native people generally, but also artists. And I think a lot of that has to do with a lot of this information being shared and there being a kind of, I don't know, kind of a structural commonality coming up, I think, between our different home communities.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Jeffrey. That's, that's striking. And one of the things that, yes, like I said, in your project is this idea of a sort of transcultural approach that allows for all of this incredible diversity within Native perspectives to really flourish in the format of your book. Which then, of course, makes sense too. You would treat different projects differently in terms of, page real estate, or how often do you need to encounter a project in order to understand what it's saying in the pages of a book. We have a question. Someone is asking, for those of you receiving NEA or NEH funding, have you altered your framing of Indigenous projects as a result of the current era? I guess this is like political era.
I guess that's for me, partially because I lost a major NEH grant. Um, I mean, there was no option to alter your framing. There was an option to reapply for the NEH grant that I had. And then in the middle, after we'd started this insanely complicated application, even though I'd already won it fair and square, they I think they realized that legally they couldn't reoffer money that they'd already given out because it was tied up in a lawsuit, many lawsuits. So at this point, my lawsuit is still in play, and I, I dream that one day I will get back the money that I worked very hard to get. But we did do as much as we possibly humanly could in 3 months. I wish we had done more. We'll see if they take away the equipment that they bought us, which they have mentioned doing. So yeah, I did try to reframe, or I worked with my wonderful postdoc to help me. Basically, I was like, oh, do I have to now be racist against myself to get this money back so we can continue this work that I believe in? We didn't have the chance to even try, but I did. We had long discussions about what that would look like, to rewrite it without using the word indigenous, or without using the word Lakota, or um, but yeah.
Incredible. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry to hear that. Did I see though that your Abundance Intelligences has like 6-year funding and somewhere in the middle of that cycle? And
Yeah,
that's more international, so it's not as
it's
jeopardized, right?
we're lovingly funded by New Frontiers Research Fund and the Social Science Humanities Research Committee in Canada, and we have a bunch of lots of other smaller funding groups. So we're very grateful for that, and are very well supported.
Mm. I mean, we only have a couple minutes left, but of course, the disappearance of some of these major platforms or their perversion. I mean, not to mention the American Pavilion in Venice, and what's going to happen there this year. But funding, of course, is a big question. And Candace, I know that you are working at a foundation, and maybe that would be something to end on here. Is just how are you approaching doing the work right now?
Hmm. Yeah, we are a nonprofit, so we're not a foundation. But just sharing that it's not just NEA or NEH. We're living through a moment of manufactured scarcity. But I think, the path through that is by knowing that we as Indigenous people have always made other worlds, even when we've been heavily discriminated against. So I think that one of the things that we're thinking a lot about at Forge, and we don't have funding from NEA or NEH, but we have lots of other foundations who support our work, both large and small, and other individuals, is a reminder that there's a real need actually to invest in the work that Native people are doing at this moment, because in some cases it is our opportunity to not only imagine they are projects of world building, but we need to invest in these other worlds at a moment when there's a kind of contraction in other places. Fundamentally, I think we need to bring these things into balance. So that's something that we do and we think about and we enact also at Forge.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
Any
think we do
final?
all of our work collectively. So, but it's kind of a wild moment just to say what Suzanne said, that like even the idea now that we kind of have to work more in these legal frameworks to show how an Indigenous project is somehow not discriminatory.
Right. Yeah, it's very mind-bending.
Mhm.
And one thing that's so interesting in the way that all of you also presented was you mentioned the Rockefeller Foundation, these moments where funding has come forward through different sources to make things possible. And so, yes, if anyone's on here and wants to step up, now is the time. I want to really thank all of you for being here in conversation with us tonight. Really appreciated it. And I hope that everyone in the audience will go out to see their work in the museums where it currently is, pick up a copy of An Indigenous Present. Someone asked what Jeffrey's book is titled. I apologize if I didn't mention that. And of course, Candace's Reader, and Kite, you have all kinds of work coming up on the horizon. So thanks again, everyone, and have a good night to our audience.